November 26, 1943, skies above Bremen, Germany. The pencil trembled slightly as Major Francis Gabreski noted the moment in his logbook after landing. Words that would have seemed impossible just 8 months earlier, when experienced RAF pilots openly questioned whether the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolt could withstand combat against nimble German fighters. The Luftwaffe will learn to fear the dive. We have uncovered something they cannot counter. Through the frost-covered canopy at 28,000 feet, he had just observed his squadron execute a maneuver that defied every assumption about aerial combat doctrine inherited from the First World War. Instead of turning horizontally to engage the enemy, his pilots rolled inverted and plunged straight down at speeds nearing 500 miles per hour, a velocity that would have ripped the wings off nearly any other fighter in the European theater. The Messerschmitt Bf-110s never saw death descending from above. One moment they were climbing confidently toward the vulnerable Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, and the next, 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns were unleashing devastating fire into their fuselages from a fighter that emerged from the sun like a thunderbolt from Zeus himself. The mathematics of aerial dominance were being rewritten not in turning radius or climb rate, but in the terrifying physics of a nearly 4-ton fighter achieving terminal velocity in a controlled dive, then using that accumulated kinetic energy to zoom climb back to altitude, where thin air and turbocharging gave American pilots an insurmountable edge. Gabreski destroyed 2 Bf-110s that day using these tactics, earning the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions defending the bomber stream. The transformation had begun on April 13, 1943, when the 56th Fighter Group flew its first combat mission, a fighter sweep over Saint-Omer in occupied France. The pilots were anxious. They had trained for 8 months on the P-47 Thunderbolt, but many remained doubtful about the aircraft's combat effectiveness. At nearly 14,000 pounds fully loaded in standard combat configuration, and up to 17,500 pounds with external ordnance, the Thunderbolt was the heaviest single-engine fighter ever constructed. It outweighed the elegant Supermarine Spitfire by 4,000 pounds and dwarfed the Focke-Wulf FW-190 by 3,000 pounds. Critics derisively called it a milk bottle, with detractors nicknaming it the 7-ton milk jug, eventually shortened simply to the Jug. RAF pilots who had successfully defended Britain in agile Spitfires openly doubted whether such a massive aircraft could survive against seasoned Luftwaffe pilots flying nimble German fighters. Among the skeptics was Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson, newly graduated from pilot training and terrified he would perish in his first week of combat. His personal accounts, documented in post-war interviews and in his memoir Corriton with Martin Kaidin, chronicle one of the most dramatic evolutions in aviation warfare history. The journey from doubt to mastery began at Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, where Georgian engineer Alexander Kartveli had designed something radically different from any other fighter. Kartveli had famously sketched the P-47 on a train after the XP-44 project was cancelled, later describing his creation with characteristic humor as a dinosaur, but a dinosaur with good proportions. The P-47 was built around the massive Pratt & Whitney or 2800 double Wasp engine, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, generating 2,000 horsepower at sea level, with water injection boosting output to 2,300 horsepower for combat emergencies. Some variants, like the P-47M, would eventually achieve 2,800 horsepower, making them among the most powerful piston engine fighters ever built. This immense power was channeled through a sophisticated turbo-supercharger system buried deep in the rear fuselage, which became the key to everything the P-47 could accomplish. Exhaust gases were routed along both sides of the cockpit through extensive ducting to drive a General Electric turbine mounted in the belly, spinning at 21,300 revolutions per minute at full power. This turbine compressed incoming air and fed it back to the engine via an intercooler system that lowered temperatures and increased density. The outcome was revolutionary. The system enabled the R-2800 to produce maximum power at 27,000 feet, and at 30,000 feet, in the thin stratosphere where other fighters struggled for oxygen, the Thunderbolt remained faster and stronger than any German fighter. The P-47 could operate effectively up to its service ceiling of 42,000 feet, an altitude where Luftwaffe pilots found their aircraft underperforming. But this remarkable capability came at a cost: weight. The turbocharger system with its complex ducting, extensive pilot armor, including a 69 pounds armored headrest and thick plating behind the seat, self-sealing fuel tanks holding 370 gallons internally, and 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns with 425 rounds each, 3,400 rounds total, created an aircraft skeptics believed was far too heavy to maneuver effectively in combat. Empty weight alone exceeded 9,900 pounds, and combat-loaded weight surpassed 14,000 pounds before adding external ordnance. Lieutenant Johnson wrote in correspondence after his April 13 first mission, "I saw the challenges ahead. The Germans had been fighting for years. We were entering combat in an aircraft many believed was the wrong tool for the job. Yet Colonel Zemper seemed confident we would find our way. Missions through late April and May 1943 were cautious, fighter sweeps along the coast, learning the terrain, testing equipment, and gradually building experience without rushing into engagements that could decimate an inexperienced unit. The first major test came on June 12, 1943, during a mission designated RAF Rodeo 204 over the Belgian coast. Captain Walter V. Cook of the 61st Fighter Squadron spotted a FW-190 at lower altitude near Blankenberge, Belgium. Following the altitude advantage doctrine Colonel Hubert Zemper had drilled into his pilots, Cook dove on the unsuspecting German fighter, fired a burst from his .50 caliber guns, and watched the FW-190 spiral toward the ground, trailing smoke. It was the 56th Fighter Group's first confirmed aerial victory and had been achieved using the diving attack that would become their hallmark. The very next day, June 13, 1943, the 56th Fighter Group scored 3 more victories, validating the tactics Zemper had developed. Lieutenant Robert Johnson scored his first kill that day, diving from altitude onto an FW-190 over Brugge, France. The German pilot never saw him coming. Johnson fired a precise burst, saw strikes on the enemy fighter, and watched it spin into the ground. Upon landing, Major General Karl Spaatz, commanding the 8th Air Force, personally presented him with a bottle of Scotch whiskey to commemorate being among the first 8th Air Force pilots to score victories in the new P-47. However, Johnson also learned a harsh lesson that day. His element leader had not followed to provide cover during the attack, leaving him isolated and under assault by multiple German fighters. He was simultaneously reprimanded by his commanders, including Gabreski and Captain Gerald W. Johnson, for breaking formation during the engagement even though his kill was confirmed. The incident highlighted the critical importance of tactical discipline. Diving attacks required coordinated execution and mutual support. Individual glory meant nothing if pilots were lost to enemy fighters during or after their attack runs. Nothing in those early missions had prepared the pilots for what would be discovered during high-altitude testing in the United States. On November 13, 1942, months before the 56th Fighter Group deployed to England, Lieutenants Harold Comstock and Roger Dyer had pushed their P-47C Thunderbolts into near-vertical dives from 35,000 feet during high-altitude performance trials. What happened next proved crucial to understanding the P-47's true capabilities and limitations. Their airspeed indicators climbed past 500 miles per hour, then 600, eventually showing 725 miles per hour indicated airspeed. The actual true airspeed was likely lower, around 550 to 600 miles per hour, as pedostatic instruments become increasingly inaccurate at high speeds and altitudes. Republic Aviation claimed the pilots had exceeded the speed of sound, making them the first humans to break the sound barrier, a claim disputed by many aviation experts. General Henry H. Arnold sent a telegram ordering no further discussion of the dive. Post-war analysis indicated the highest confirmed Mach number achieved by any World War II propeller-driven fighter was approximately 0.92, by a specially modified Spitfire. P-47s likely did not exceed this. Nevertheless, Comstock and Dyer's experience during those dives proved critically important for combat operations. Beyond approximately 550 miles per hour indicated airspeed, they encountered severe compressibility effects as localized airflow over the wings approached transonic speeds. Controls became stiff and nearly unresponsive. The aircraft were diving almost straight down, accelerating continuously, and conventional recovery seemed impossible. Both pilots experienced tunnel vision from the G-forces and genuine terror as their aircraft plummeted with frozen controls. Yet both Comstock and Dyer managed to recover. Their technique would be taught to every P-47 pilot who followed. The critical procedure, later documented by combat pilots including Charles D. Umal, involved pushing firmly on the control stick with both hands while keeping trim tabs locked in neutral. Pilots were explicitly warned never to adjust trim tabs during compressibility recovery, as overcontrol could be fatal once the aircraft entered denser air. Correct technique required maintaining steady manual stick pressure while descending through the compressibility zone. As the P-47 descended below 15,000 feet, compressibility effects gradually diminished, elevators regained responsiveness, and pilots could safely complete the pullout. Both Comstock and Dyer completed their recoveries with less than 2,000 feet to spare, their bodies compressed into the seats by forces exceeding 7 to 8 gs. Upon reporting their experiences to Republic Aviation and Wright Field engineers, the response was immediate and thorough. Every P-47 pilot would receive extensive training in recognizing compressibility onset and executing proper recovery procedures. More importantly, engineers discovered that the P-47's thick wing design, which made it a poor turner compared to thinner winged fighters, actually delayed the onset of critical Compressibility effects. The Thunderbolt could dive faster and recover more reliably than any contemporary fighter. Later, P-47D variants would be equipped with dive recovery flaps, small surfaces that could be deployed during high-speed dives to help manage compressibility and assist with recovery. This capability would prove absolutely decisive in combat. Throughout May and June 1943, Colonel Zker drilled his pilots relentlessly in the tactics that would exploit the P-47's unique strengths. Climb to 30,000 feet or higher before reaching the combat area. Maintain disciplined formation with proper spacing for mutual support. Never chase enemy fighters down to low altitude where the P-47's weaknesses in turning and acceleration were exposed. When enemies appeared below, roll inverted to keep the target in sight. Pull 4 to 5G to point the nose downward and dive at maximum throttle setting. The accumulated speed, often exceeding 480 miles per hour and sometimes reaching 500 miles per hour or more, made the P-47 nearly impossible for German fighters to evade. The attacking pilot would fire a burst from 850 caliber machine guns, each gun cycling at approximately 800 rounds per minute, creating a combined rate of fire around 6,400 rounds per minute or over 100 rounds per second. At high closing speeds, even a two-canned burst delivered devastating firepower. Then, before German fighters could react or defensive measures could be taken, the P-47 pilot would pull back firmly on the stick, use all that kinetic energy to zoom, climb back above the fight, and regain altitude advantage within 40 to 60 seconds. The skeptics remained numerous through those early months. Many pilots found it difficult to abandon traditional fighter tactics, emphasizing turning and twisting to get behind the enemy. Some questioned whether running away in a dive could truly be called fighting. On June 26, 1943, during escort duty for B-17 bombers returning from a mission to Villacouble, France, 48 P-47Cs of the 56th Fighter Group were bounced by 16 Faller-Wolf FW-190 of Yogeshwata 26 near Forges Lazo. The engagement would prove both costly and educational. Lieutenant Johnson's P-47C, nicknamed Half Pint, was hit early in the fight by multiple 20mm cannon shells. His canopy shattered. Hydraulic lines were severed, spraying fluid across his windscreen. The cockpit caught fire briefly. Shrapnel from exploding cannon shell struck Johnson's nose, causing bleeding and partial disorientation. Most pilots would have abandoned the aircraft immediately, but Johnson discovered his canopy would not open, trapping him in the dying fighter. With no choice but to fly or die, Johnson pushed the nose down and dove for the English Channel at maximum speed. An FW-190 followed, firing repeatedly into the already crippled P-47C. More cannon shells tore through Johnson's wings and fuselage. The German pilot apparently expended all his ammunition on the defenseless American fighter, then flew alongside, looked directly at Johnson, saluted, and broke away. Whether this represented respect for courage or simply acknowledgement that further attacks were pointless, Johnson never knew. But the massive Pratt & Whitney R-28,000 engine continued running despite taking multiple hits. The robust airframe, designed with thick structural members and redundant systems, held together despite catastrophic damage. Johnson coaxed the battered P-47C across the English Channel, found RAF Manston Emergency Airfield, and executed a perfect landing despite having almost no forward visibility through the hydraulic fluid-coated windscreen. Ground crews counted over 200 bullet and cannon shell holes in the aircraft without completely circling it. The right wing had structural members severed. The fuselage had holes large enough to insert a fist. Hydraulic systems were completely destroyed. Yet Johnson walked away with only minor injuries from shrapnel, and remarkably the P-47C was eventually repaired and returned to service. This mission cost the 56th Fighter Group 4 aircraft and pilots their worst single mission loss to date, but it also demonstrated the P-47's extraordinary ability to absorb punishment and bring pilots home alive. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on August 17, 1943, provided the first major validation of diving attack tactics on a large scale. The 8th Air Force launched 376 heavy bombers in a daring double strike against ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and aircraft production facilities at Regensburg deep in Germany. The bombers would fly hundreds of miles beyond the escort range of most Allied fighters. The P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group were assigned to provide penetration escort for the Regensburg force, taking the bombers as far as their fuel allowed before turning back toward England. Major Gebreski, leading elements of the 61st Fighter Squadron, positioned his flights at 30,000 feet, 5,000 feet above the bomber stream. German fighters were climbing from multiple airfields across northern France and Belgium. Approximately 40 Bf-109s and FW-190s in several formations, timing their arrival to catch the bombers when P-47 escorts would be at the limit of their fuel range. What the German pilots did not expect was the coordinated diving attack from superior altitude. Multiple P-47 flights rolled inverted simultaneously, pointed their noses at steep dive angles between 45 and 60 degrees, and accelerated toward the climbing German fighters at speeds the Luftwaffe pilots had never encountered in combat. From American fighters, the engagement lasted approximately 20 minutes and spread across 70 miles of German and Belgian airspace. P-47 pilots executed textbook diving attacks, struck hard, and recovered to altitude for repeated attacks. The 56th Fighter Group claimed 16 German fighters destroyed, 9 damaged, and 1 probable for the loss of 3 P-47s. German records documented 22 aircraft lost that day across all units, with 11 pilots killed and 8 more wounded. Among the dead was Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, Group and commander of the 2nd Grouper of Jagdguard, 26, brother of the famous General Adolf Galland. Galland had scored 55 victories before encountering P-47 diving tactics he could not counter. Captain Walker Bud Maharin of the 56th Fighter Group was credited with the probable kill, diving from altitude at over 480 miles per hour and striking Galland's FW-190 with a concentrated burst. The German fighter disintegrated from the concentration of 50 caliber fire. Galland's body was found 2 months later, still strapped in his seat, driven 12 feet into the ground by the impact. The psychological impact on remaining Yagashata 26 pilots was profound. One of their most experienced leaders had been killed by tactics he never saw coming. More importantly for the strategic picture, the bomber stream lost far fewer aircraft than expected during the period when P-47 escort was present. The Thunderbolts had proven they could protect the bombers that were systematically destroying Germany's ability to wage war. This was the real measure of success. High kill ratios mattered only insofar as they protected the bombers and allowed the strategic bombing campaign to continue. October 1943 brought the full maturation of P-47 diving tactics and demonstrated kill ratios that would have seemed impossible just 6 months earlier. The missions that month showed what properly trained pilots using correct doctrine could achieve. On October 4, 1943, during an escort mission to Frankfurt, the 56th Fighter Group encountered approximately 60 German fighters attempting to intercept the bomber stream near Cologne using altitude advantage and disciplined diving attacks. The 56th destroyed approximately 15 Bf-110 twin-engine fighters along with single-engine fighters, claiming 16 total victories, while losing 2 P-47s to anti-aircraft fire rather than enemy fighters. On October 8, Lieutenant Johnson, flying as wingman to Captain Gerald W. Johnson, executed another textbook diving attack that brought his score to 4 victories. Positioned at 29,000 foot over Bremen, Johnson spotted an FW-190 attacking another P-47 from the pilot's blind spot. Johnson rolled inverted, pulled 4G to point his nose at the German fighter below, and pushed throttle to maximum emergency power. At 26,000 feet and 460 miles per hour, he squeezed the trigger. 850 caliber machine guns converged their fire on the FW-190. Johnson saw pieces flying off the German fighter before it rolled over and fell spinning toward the ground. Johnson immediately pulled back to zoom climb, gained 3,000 feet of altitude in less than 30 seconds and was back in position to assist other squadron members within 1 minute. The entire attack sequence from initial Roll into altitude recovery took approximately 50 seconds. This was the essence of boom and zoom tactics executed to perfection. 2 days later, on October 10, 1943, Johnson became an ace during a massive engagement over Muster. His squadron intercepted approximately 40 German fighters attempting to destroy B-7s during their withdrawal from the target area. In the swirling battle that followed, Johnson executed 3 separate diving attacks within 25 minutes. He destroyed 1 Mess's Bf-110 twin-engine fighter and 1 Focke-Wulf FW-190 escort, bringing his total score to 5 confirmed victories and earning ace status. Unknown to Johnson at the time, one of these victories was Oberstleutnant Hans Philipp, commander of Jagdgeschwader 1, an extraordinarily experienced pilot. With 206 total victories, including 177 on the Eastern Front and 29 in the West. Johnson would not learn this pilot's identity until 50 years later, when German and American researchers compared combat reports. But Johnson paid a price for pressing his attacks aggressively that day. During his final diving run, he was hit by return fire from a Bf-110's rear defensive gunner. 20mm cannon shells tore through his right wing and fuselage, destroying hydraulic systems and damaging control surfaces. The P-47D began smoking and losing hydraulic fluid rapidly. Johnson pointed the damaged aircraft toward England and began what would become one of the longest flights of his life. German fighters recognized a crippled opponent and moved in for the kill. 3 separate times, FW-19S attempted to finish off Johnson's damaged Thunderbolt. 3 times Johnson pushed his nose down, built speed to over 400 miles per hour despite damaged controls and severe vibration, and pulled away from his pursuers. Even critically damaged, the P-47D could still outdive any German fighter. Johnson nursed the shaking, smoking aircraft across Belgium and over the English Channel at gradually decreasing altitude. He found an emergency landing field and brought the battered fighter down in a textbook landing despite severely degraded controls and minimal forward visibility. Ground crews counted the damage and marveled that Johnson had survived. The P-47D had over 200 bullet and cannon shell holes. The right wing had lost structural integrity with multiple longerons severed. The fuselage had damage that penetrated deep into critical systems. But the massive Pratt & Whitney R-28,000 had continued running smoothly throughout, losing only 1 or 2 of its 18 cylinders. The airframe had held together despite catastrophic battle damage. Johnson walked away without serious injury, and after extensive repairs, the P-47D returned to combat operations. These October 1943 missions demonstrated something as important as the diving tactics themselves. The P-47 combined offensive capability through high-speed diving attacks with defensive survivability through robust construction and redundant systems. A pilot could press attacks aggressively, knowing that even if hit, the aircraft could likely bring him home. This psychological confidence enabled more aggressive tactics and better mission results. By November 1943, the 56th Fighter Group's tactical doctrine was being adopted throughout the 8th Air Force. Every P-47 unit learned to think vertically rather than horizontally. Altitude was life. Speed was survival. Discipline was victory. Never chase an enemy down to his altitude unless absolutely necessary for bomber protection. Never turn when you can dive. Never engage fairly when you can. Attack with overwhelming advantage. The kill ratio statistics from this period demonstrate extraordinary effectiveness. During the period from June through December 1943, when tactics were fully developed and pilots gained combat, the 56th Fighter Group achieved kills to losses ratios approaching 11-1 when considering only aircraft lost to enemy fighters in air combat. Even when including all operational losses from mechanical failures, weather, and ground fire, the ratio remained above 5-1. When examining only engagements where P-47 pilots maintained altitude discipline and followed diving attack doctrine, kill ratios exceeded 15-1 and occasionally approached 20-1 in ideal conditions. The tactics worked because they exploited fundamental physics that could not be countered by pilot skill or tactical innovation. The P-47 at 30,000 feet had potential energy equivalent to 9.44 million foot lb, When diving to 20,000 feet, this converted to kinetic energy, producing speeds approaching or exceeding 500 miles per hour. No German fighter could safely match this speed. The FW-190's maximum dive speed was limited to approximately 450 miles per hour, indicated air speed before structural concerns became critical. The Bf-109 faced similar limitations with additional control difficulties at high speeds. After firing on a target at 20,000 feet, a P-47 pilot pulling 4 to 5G in the recovery could zoom climb back to 28 or 29,000 feet using accumulated kinetic energy. The entire attack cycle from 30,000 foot down to 20,000 feet and back up to 28,000 ft consumed less than 90 seconds and required minimal fuel. A German fighter attempting to climb from 20,000 feet to 30,000 feet required 4 to 6 minutes and consumed significant fuel while the pilot's engine lost power continuously as altitude increased. The psychological effect on Luftwaffe pilots became measurably significant by late 1943 and early 1944. German combat reports increasingly mentioned avoiding engagement with P-47s. Above 25,000 feet, some squadrons began refusing to climb to high altitude altogether, concentrating their efforts on attacking bombers during their initial climb or final descent when P-47 escort was less effective, but this exposed German fighters to defensive fire from the bombers and reduced attack effectiveness. Major G.A. Rahl, who commanded the 2nd Grouper of Jägerschwade 11-4, approximately 1 month from April 19 to May 12, 1944, before being shot down and wounded, later provided insight into German tactical thinking. In post-war interviews, explained that by late 1943, experienced German pilots recognized the P-47 was most dangerous when it had altitude advantage. American pilots were learning to use their aircraft correctly, refusing to be lured down to altitudes where German fighters had turning and acceleration advantages. Instead, P-47s attacked repeatedly from above, diving so fast German pilots could barely track them visually, firing quick bursts and climbing away before effective response was possible. If German fighters climbed to meet the P-47s, the American fighters simply climbed higher using superior high-altitude engine performance. The only partial solution German units developed was attacking bombers quickly from lower altitudes and escaping before P-47s could dive on them. But this gave German pilots less time to aim carefully, and bomber defensive fire was more effective against attacks from below. Survived the war with 275 total victories, the third highest score in aviation history, and later served in the West German Luftwaffe from 1956 to 1975. The diving tactics required exceptional physical conditioning and technique. Pulling out of a 500 miles per hour dive generated forces exceeding 7 times gravity. Blood drained from the brain toward the lower body. Vision narrowed to a tunnel. Some pilots lost consciousness briefly at the bottom of their dives, recovering only as the aircraft naturally began to level off. To counter this, P-47 pilots developed anti-graining techniques borrowed from dive bomber operations. They would tense leg muscles and abdominal muscles vigorously during the pull-out, effectively raising blood pressure and helping maintain blood flow to the brain. They would grunt or shout loudly, forcing air pressure into their lungs and chest cavity. They learned to limit their pull-out to 6 to 6.5 G when possible, accepting a slightly shallower recovery angle to reduce blackout risk while still achieving effective zoom climb performance. These techniques combined with youth and fitness allowed most pilots to remain conscious and effective throughout their attack runs, but the physical toll accumulated over time. Pilots who flew multiple high-intensity missions per day would return to base physically exhausted, their bodies aching from repeated hygiene maneuvers. Some pilots experienced vision problems from repeated exposure to high G-forces. Others dealt with chronic back pain from compression of the spine during pull-outs. The winter of 1943 into 1944 brought new challenges as the bombing campaign intensified and missions penetrated deeper into Germany. On January 11, 1944, during an escort mission to Asches deep in central Germany, the 56th Fighter Group encountered over 100 German fighters in a desperate attempt to destroy the bomber stream. The engagement lasted nearly 1 hour and spread across 150 miles of German airspace. Major Gebreski, now serving as the group's operations officer, led formations from 29,000 feet. He personally executed 6 separate diving attacks during the extended engagement, destroying 3 enemy aircraft and damaging 2 more. His combat report described the mission as the most intense he had experienced, with P-47S and German fighters mixing in a swirling aerial battle that consumed thousands of gallons of fuel and thousands of rounds of ammunition. The 56th Fighter Group claimed 22 German fighters destroyed that day for the loss of 4 P-47S, 3 to enemy fighters and 1 to mechanical failure. The kill ratio of approximately 5.5 to 1 was slightly below the group's average, but still impressive given the intensity and duration of the engagement. More significantly, bomber losses were far lower than expected. Only 5 P-7S were shot down during the period when P-47 escort was present, compared to much higher losses on unescorted portions of the mission. This protective mission success mattered more than raw kill statistics. February 1944 brought Operation Argument, known to participants as Big Week, 6 days of maximum effort bombing raids from February 20th through 25th against German aircraft production facilities. The 8th Air Force launched over 3,000 heavy bomber sorties, and the Luftwaffe responded with everything available. The 56th Fighter Group flew 16 major missions during Big Week and the immediate aftermath, logging more combat hours than any other fighter group. The diving tactics perfected over 9 months of combat were now being executed by pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience against German pilots with decreasing experience levels. The results during this period were devastating for the Luftwaffe. Through Big Week and into the first half of March, the 56th Fighter Group destroyed approximately 87 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, far exceeding previous monthly totals. On February 20th, during an escort to Leipzig, they destroyed 15 German fighters without loss. On February 22nd, escorting bombers to Halpa, they destroyed 12 more. The accumulated effect of these losses broke the Luftwaffe's ability to effectively defend German airspace in daylight. German fighter units were losing experienced pilots faster than training programs could produce replacements. New German pilots arrived at operational units with minimal flight time, often less than 50 hours in type, compared to American pilots arriving with 150 to 200 hours of flight training. These inexperienced German pilots were particularly vulnerable to P-47 diving attacks. They lacked the situational awareness to see attackers coming from above. They made mistakes in defensive maneuvering. They panicked and dove away reflexively, playing directly into the P-47's greatest strength. By March 1944, air superiority over Germany was largely achieved. German fighters still appeared, but in smaller numbers and with noticeably less aggressive tactics. On March 6, 1944, the 56th Fighter Group flew escort all the way to Berlin and back without encountering a single German fighter willing to engage at high altitude. The Luftwaffe had learned through painful experience that engaging P-47S above 25,000 feet was nearly suicidal. P-47 pilots began transitioning increasingly to fighter-bomber missions, carrying 500 or 1,000 pounds bombs and high-velocity aircraft rockets to attack ground targets. But even in the ground attack role, the diving attack capability remained crucial. P-47S would orbit at high altitude above 25,000 feet. Spot targets like locomotive repair facilities or truck convoys, roll in from altitude in steep dives exceeding 60 degrees, release their weapons from 4 to 6,000 feet, and zoom climb back to safety before anti-aircraft gunners could accurately track and engage them. The same physics that made the P-47A devastating air superiority fighter made it an equally effective fighter bomber. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gebreski, who became the highest-scoring American ace in the European theater, achieved his final victory on July 5, 1944, bringing his total to 28 confirmed kills, all achieved flying P-47 Thunderbolts with the 56th Fighter Group. 15 days later, on July 20, 1944, Gebreski's luck ran out. While strafing Bassenheim airfield at low altitude, his P-47 struck the ground, damaging the propeller and forcing him to crash land in German-held territory. He was captured and spent the final 9 months of the war as a prisoner. In post-war interviews, Gabreski consistently credited the diving attack tactics developed by Xena for the 56th Fighter Group's achievements. When we arrived in England in January 1943, Gabreski recalled years later, most pilots assumed the P-47 was too heavy and unwieldy to be effective. British pilots warned us we would be slaughtered. During the first weeks, it seemed they might be right. Pilots attempting conventional tactics, turning and twisting to get behind the enemy, found limited success. Then Colonel Kerr introduced a different approach. We stopped trying to turn with German fighters. We began exploiting our real advantages: altitude performance, diving speed, and structural strength. We struck from above, hit hard, and climbed back before the enemy could react. Suddenly, we were winning. The same aircraft that seemed like a liability became our greatest asset. Robert Johnson completed his combat tour with 27 confirmed victories in 91 missions, surpassing Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 victories. He returned to the U.S. in May 1944. Spending the remainder of the war on war bond tours and training new pilots. In his memoir Thunderbolt, co-written with Martin Caidin, Johnson emphasized the importance of discipline and tactical doctrine. Individual bravery and flying skill were important, he noted, but tactics executed correctly based on aircraft capabilities mattered more. A competent pilot following proper doctrine could defeat an exceptional pilot using incorrect tactics. The 56th Fighter Group's operational statistics demonstrate the ultimate effectiveness of diving attack doctrine. From April 1943 through April 1945, the group flew 447 combat missions and achieved 674.5 confirmed aerial victories. According to USAF Historical Study No. 85, more than any other 8th Air Force fighter group, they lost only 60 aircraft to enemy fighters in air-to-air combat, producing a kill ratio of 11.2 to 1. Including all operational losses, 128 aircraft due to mechanical failure, weather, or ground fire, the kill ratio remained approximately 5.3 to 1. These figures represented not just numbers but lives saved and missions accomplished. Every German fighter down meant one less threat to the bomber streams. Every bomber protected ensured crews survived and targets were destroyed. The strategic bombing campaign succeeded largely because P-47s and other escort fighters achieved air dominance over Germany, allowing bombers to systematically destroy the industrial infrastructure sustaining the German war effort. Individual pilots amassed remarkable records using tactics honed by the 56th Fighter Group. Francis Gabreski scored 28 victories, all in P-47s. Robert Johnson's 27 victories were all in P-47s. David Schilling achieved 22 3/4 victories, and Walker Mahurin recorded 21 before transferring to other duties. All credited their success to diving attack tactics developed by ZMA and refined over hundreds of combat missions. The P-47's performance across theaters validated the diving attack approach. The Thunderbolt flew over 746,000 sorties during World War II, with an aerial kill ratio of 4.6 to 1 while losing 3,499 aircraft from all causes. Units employing disciplined high-altitude diving tactics achieved kill ratios of 8 to 1 to 15 to 1, while those that deviated from doctrine or fought primarily at low altitudes fared much worse. Technical specifications enabling these tactics reflected Alexander Kartvelli and Republic Aviation's engineering mastery. The P-47D, equipping most combat units, had a wingspan of 40 feet 9 inches, length of 36 feet 1 inch, and height of 14 feet 8 inches. Combat weight ranged from 14,000 to 17,500 pounds depending on external stores. Maximum speed reached 433 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Climb rate approximately 2,700 feet per minute at sea level, and service ceiling was 42,000 feet. Combat radius with external tanks reached roughly 460 miles. Armament consisted of 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 4 per wing, with 425 rounds each, 3,400 rounds total, delivering sustained firepower for about 30 seconds of continuous firing. Pilots typically used 1 to 3 second bursts to extend ammunition over multiple engagements. The P-47's Pratt & Whitney Air 2800 engine displaced 2,840 cu and across 18 cylinders in 2 rows. Rated power produced 2,000 horsepower at 2,700 revolutions per minute, with water methanol injection boosting output to 2,300 horsepower for up to 5 minutes. This power drove a 4-blade Curtiss electric propeller, 12 feet 2 inches diameter, whose tips approached sonic velocity at high speeds, signaling pilots that compressibility limits were near. The General Electric Type B11 turbo supercharger, housed in the rear fuselage, spun at 21,300 revolutions per minute using exhaust gases to drive a centrifugal compressor, pressurizing air for full power at 30,000 feet. Intercoolers reduced temperature and increased density for optimal performance. The airframe was robust. Main wing spars could withstand 8G positive and 3.5G negative loads. Fuselage longerons and bulkheads were designed to protect pilots in severe crashes. Armor included a 69 pounds armored headrest, 1/4 in armor behind the seat, 3 of 8 in protection for engine accessories, and bulletproof windscreen panels. Self-sealing fuel tanks used rubber and fabric layers that expanded when punctured to prevent catastrophic leakage. These features created an aircraft optimized for high-altitude, energy-based combat. The P-47 could climb to 30,000 feet, dive from superior altitude at speeds unmatched by enemies, absorb damage that would destroy lighter fighters, and zoom climb back for repeated attacks. German pilots attempting to counter these tactics faced impossible choices: meet P-47s at altitude, where American performance dominated, or lure them down to exploit perceived weaknesses, only to have P-47 pilots refuse engagement and maintain air superiority. The impact of P-47 diving tactics extended beyond immediate combat to strategic effects. The Luftwaffe's inability to defend German airspace in 1944 stemmed partly from unsustainable pilot losses. German training programs could not replenish experienced pilots quickly, leaving minimally trained recruits vulnerable to disciplined American tactics. By spring 1944, frontline American pilots had substantially more flight hours and combat experience than their German counterparts. Combined with superior high-altitude performance and disciplined tactics, this created an overwhelming advantage. The P-47's contribution to air superiority enabled the destruction of German oil, aircraft factories, ball bearing plants, and transportation networks, a critical factor in Allied victory. Lessons learned with the P-47 influenced fighter design and doctrine for decades. Post-war analysis confirmed that boom and zoom tactics, leveraging speed and energy management, were far more effective than traditional turning dogfights. Jet fighters that followed, including the F-86 Sabre and F-100 Super Sabre, emphasized speed, climb rate, and energy tactics over turning ability. Gabreski himself flew F-86s in Korea, applying the same principles, achieving 6.5 MiG-15 kills and becoming one of 7 Americans to earn ace status in 2 wars. German prisoners consistently described P-47 diving attacks as terrifying. Oberleutnant Heinzka, who surrendered in March 1945 after years of combat, explained, "You'd be climbing to engage bombers, and suddenly your wingman exploded beside you. You'd look up and see American fighters diving nearly vertically at impossible speeds. By the time you reacted, they were already climbing away, untouchable." The physics of the diving attack remained unmatched in the propeller era. Modern simulations confirm that P-47s following proper altitude discipline and diving tactics achieved kill ratios exceeding 20-1 against comparable German fighters. Only when pilots abandoned doctrine in low-altitude dogfights did enemy fighters gain an advantage. The lesson was clear: exploiting an aircraft's real strengths always prevailed over assumptions about desired capabilities. The P-47 was not the lightest, most agile, or longest-range fighter initially, but it was the fastest diver, most survivable, and most effective at high altitude. Tactics built around these strengths produced extraordinary results. The 56th Fighter Group transformed an aircraft deemed too heavy into an air superiority machine, identifying advantages, developing tactics, training relentlessly, and maintaining discipline under extreme stress. The result: protection of thousands of bomber crews and unmatched air dominance. Colonel Hubert Zenke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group during this period, later reflected, "I had an aircraft everyone said was wrong and pilots terrified of experienced Germans. I had to find what the P-47 could do well and build tactics around it. The dive became everything. We could dive faster than anyone, recover from dives that would kill other pilots, and zoom climb back to altitude repeatedly. Once mastered, we were unstoppable." By war's end, the P-47 had proven itself among the most effective fighters in history. Its aggregate record of 746,000 sorties and 4.6-1 kill ratio represented solid performance, but the 56th Fighter Group's disciplined execution, 11-1 in air-to-air, 5.3-1 including all losses, demonstrated what could be achieved with proper tactics. Gabreski's 28 victories in 166 missions, Johnson's 27 in 91, and Schilling's 22.75 in 132 missions reflected roughly 1 victory per 4 sorties. The P-47 Thunderbolt story is ultimately about analysis over assumption, discipline over improvisation, and physics over tradition. Heavy fighters were assumed doomed against agile opponents, yet the 56th Fighter Group climbed to 30,000 feet in the heaviest single-engine fighter, rolled inverted, pushed forward, and discovered straight-down dives at 500 miles per hour with zoom climbs back to altitude were the fastest, safest, and most effective path to victory. German pilots never forgot, American pilots never forgot, and historians should never forget. Proper analysis, rigorous discipline, and physics-based tactics, not courage alone, won the skies and preserved thousands of lives.